F-35. I'm thrilled to be here with my co-hosts, Medea Benjamin, co-founder of CODEPINK, and Brian Garvey, Assistant Director of Massachusetts Peace Action. Before we begin tonight with our program, we want to just pay tribute to the many in Iraq and the soldiers here in the United States who either lost their lives or suffered are living with the wounds today of the U.S. criminal invasion and occupation of Iraq. So Maha Khan, who is our fabulous navigator through this Zoom, she's going to play a few videos first. So let's go. And this is at the DC protest this weekend, the march on the White House.
That's Andy Shalal.
Okay.
Where are the arrest warrants for George W. Bush? Where are the arrest warrants for Dick Cheney?
Iraqi-American Anish Shalal was protesting in Washington, D.C. ahead of the 20th anniversary of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq.
The United States should really be responsible for the damage that they caused in Iraq. 200,000 to 300,000 people have been killed directly due to the war. The United States should definitely pay reparations. We really broke Iraq, I think, in a very serious way. It's not going to be put together back the way it was, nor does it have to be.
Anas lived in Iraq until he was 11, but his family couldn't return after Saddam Hussein took control of the country.
I think, we all can agree that Saddam Hussein was a very brutal dictator and needed to be ousted, but the Iraqi people were more than capable to be able to do that. The problem they were facing is they were facing sanctions, they were facing lots of isolation from the rest of the world. And whenever you have sanctions and isolation, it's very hard to be able to have an uprising.
Anas's family suffered death and devastation as the US bombed and occupied his country.
The Iraq War impacted my family and myself in a very profound way, very personal way, obviously, because it was my homeland where I grew up in. Also, we had relatives there that we were able to communicate with on a regular basis. So we got a first-hand account of what was happening in Iraq day by day. I had an aunt who actually told me that she said every morning they wake up and they wait for the bombs to happen because once the bombs drop or they hear them, they know they weren't targeted. But she says, one day she called and she said, I wish the bomb would just drop over us because I don't know if I can continue to live through this.
Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, but the US manufactured justifications to invade the country. It said Iraq was in league with Al-Qaeda, that Iraqis needed saving from their dictator, and that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Those weapons were never found.
Americans need to know that their government lied to them. There are war criminals out there, especially George W. Bush, who continues to be now seen as a statesman and a hero in many ways. He's now an artist, painting, ironically, pictures of the people, soldiers, that were maimed and lost their limbs or their eyes or were damaged because of the war. And now he's painting them and displaying those paintings. It's a grotesque way to whitewash a crime. We have to know that war, no matter what, is going to create more damage than it solves. And until we figure that out, we will continue to take ourselves further and further and deeper into these situations that have no end in sight.
Powerful video. That is a friend of Medea's, who has been a friend of CODEPINK as well. And Maha, I think we have one other video, very powerful video, with the voices of Veterans for Peace. If we can play that, that would be terrific.
The U.S. war machine is endangering all life on this planet.
I'm ready for war, we can't feed the poor, we're fired up! We can't take it no more! We can't feed the poor, we're fired up!
U.S. veterans marched against war in Washington, D.C. 20 years after the invasion of Iraq.
We supported the industrial war-making machine with our bodies in times past. It is our responsibility now to say no to that.
They told us we were fighting for freedom and democracy, but that was a lie.
Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, but the United States manufactured justifications to invade the country.
They promoted this total lie that Iraq was part of that, and they weren't part of it.
When you're in boot camp, it's almost like you're brainwashed to believe that these things are right.
Records show the US-led war and occupation of Iraq killed around 200,000 Iraqi civilians, but some estimates have calculated a much higher death toll. Over 4,200 US soldiers also lost their lives in the war that cost trillions of dollars. But combat isn't where most US soldiers die. Since 9/11, more US soldiers and veterans have died by suicide than at war. Research by the Brown University Costs of War Project in 2021 estimated that 30,177 global war on terror veterans died by suicide, compared to 7,057 who died while on active duty.
They suffer from something called moral injury. Moral injury, which means that you feel guilty for what you were part of, and you can never escape that.
The U.S. military is so pervasive, so insidious in America's culture.
Everybody thanks me for my service, and I am so tormented by it. It's a terrible thing for someone to thank me for what I did.
Once you really get out and leave the military and really see the world outside of the military, I feel like if you're a person with any type of heart, any type of moral compass, you would see that what you were doing was wrong.
This country has always been about war. War on the people who already lived here, war on the Africans who got brought to do all the work. War on everybody all the time, take over more land, take over more control, hegemony around the world. All of that has to end, and nobody more than veterans has a platform to speak against it.
Kudos to the Veterans for Peace, Ellen Barfield, Jerry Condon, and the others who marched on the White House in DC. There were marches and protests throughout the country. I was in Los Angeles for a very spirited protest in front of CNN to call out their stenography for the Pentagon. Hundreds of people converged in Hollywood, lots of honks in support. I heard there were spirited protests elsewhere, including in San Francisco. So we'll have more on that on the Code Pink blog. Check it out, codepink.org. For now, let's just review what we're going to be doing tonight. We're looking at the 2024 military budget that Biden has proposed. Also at Code Pink's Abolish the F-35 campaign. Our guests include Lindsay Koshgarian, Program Director for the National Priorities Project, David Swanson, Executive Director of World Beyond War, and Danaka Katovich, a National Co-Director for Code Pink. At this point, Brian, perhaps you can just go over some of the articles that we posted in the chat so people will know what's there and what they might want to use as a resource.
Sure, and let me just pop these in the chat because I didn't see them added just yet.
Okay, well,
no, don't worry about it. I'm happy to do it. This first one is going to be a live stream of the Washington D.C. anti-war rally that took place on March 18th, 3 days ago. You can watch the whole protest. This next one is a video from one of our guests tonight, David Swanson. It is Iraq and the 15 lessons we never learned. And I think this is still important. I was just reading the other day, and I'm sure many of you have too, there is still a lot of apologism. Many of us have taken to heart that it was a mistake, but still seeing a lot of defense of people like George W. Bush and people looking back and saying, making apologies for this terrible, terrible war. And this last link that I'm putting in is a video from our own Medea Benjamin, along with Nicholas Davies, who was her co-author on a recent book. And this video is the not-so-winding road from Iraq to Ukraine, the links between the U.S. war in Iraq and the current war in Ukraine. All great resources. So after the program, at your leisure, feel free to check them out.
Thank you, Brian Garvey of Massachusetts Peace Action. We have one other link, Code Pink Radio. Please ask your local community radio station to broadcast our program. I co-host it this week and next. It's on Ukraine. and it's very relevant, clearly. So we are on most of the Pacifica stations, but we want to broaden our reach, and we need your help to do that. All right, let's get started with an introduction to our first guest. Brian, that's you to do the introduction.
Okay, so as I mentioned, David Swanson. We're pleased to have you. David Swanson is an author, an activist, a journalist, and a radio talk host of Talk World Radio. He's executive director of World Beyond War and campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org. David's books on war and peace include Leaving World War II Behind, an argument against the use of World War II as a reason for even more war, and War is a Lie, a catalog of the types of falsehoods regularly told about wars. David Swanson was awarded the 2018 Peace Prize by the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation, and David is on the advisory boards of Nobel Peace Prize Watch, Veterans for Peace, Assange Defense, BPUR, and Military Families Speak Out. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, David.
Thank you.
So David, tell us what you think about the military budget. I know you have a lot of thoughts about that.
Okay.
And lessons that we need to learn.
I had thought I was going second. I guess I'm going first. That's cool. So this little short presentation is called How to Reduce Military Spending. It ought to be easy. Open bank vault, remove weapons dealers, close bank vault. In reality, we need a ton of tools and work and luck. In constant dollar terms, after Korea, after Vietnam, after Reagan's second term and Obama's first term, US military spending went down, just never as much as it had gone up. So ending wars, including cold wars, may help us. We now have a war underway in which the US participation is understood as primarily spending money. Ending that spending could be expanded into reducing military spending more broadly. With Afghanistan and Iraq, it took 1.5 years or so each to get good US majorities in polls saying the wars never should have been started. The war in Ukraine appears to be on perhaps the same trajectory. Of course, those who believed that those wars shouldn't have been started did not, for the most part, believe they should be ended. The wars had to be continued for the sake of the troops, even if the actual troops were telling pollsters they wanted the wars ended. My hope is that US opposition to the war in Ukraine may grow in the absence of that troopist propaganda, as US troops are not involved in large numbers and not supposed to be involved at all. We also have the US media looking back with some glimmers of honesty here and there at 20 or so years of disastrous war spending. Some of those wars have already been ended without the appropriate reductions in military spending. We can point out that US military spending is now about double what it was in 2000. We can also point out that the Democratic Party platform of 2020 promised what we're demanding, and that once elected, Biden and the Democrats did the opposite of what they'd promised. That platform tied reducing military spending to ending the wars on Afghanistan and Yemen. They have actually ended one of those and pretended to end the other one while increasing military spending. Actually ending the war in Yemen via the War Powers Resolution might help us cut military spending. Not that ending that war is any easier, but there is an active movement working on it, and a Zoom call this Saturday about it with several Congress members expected to take part. People have generally caught on that when a bank or a corporation or a disease epidemic that impacts rich people needs money, somebody simply invents unlimited money out of nowhere. So our constant demand that military spending go down so that human and environmental spending can go up may be less persuasive. We may be giving ourselves two incredibly difficult tasks rather than making one of them easier. If the US government were willing to fund education or housing or the environment, it would simply do so. Reducing military spending wouldn't compel it to do so. I conclude that we should not shy away from all the usual comparisons of what we could get for what is spent on militarism, nor from comparing the US military with those of other countries, but that there may be something else that's more important. I mean the evil of war, the moral case against war and against the spending that generates more wars. Looking back at our efforts to end the war on Iraq, we never did even really try to teach the public that modern wars are one-sided slaughters. The fact that well over 90% of the deaths were Iraqis never got through, nor the fact that they were disproportionately the very old and the very young, nor even the fact that wars are fought in people's towns and not on 19th century battlefields. Today, the very best Congress members will tell you the war was a mistake and cost money and so forth. But just imagine on a smaller scale, murdering a bunch of your neighbors and then saying it was a mistake and you're sorry the bullets cost so much, even while buying twice as many bullets every day. The point of teaching people the immorality of war is not to feel good or to make somebody feel bad, but to mobilize action. People care. People will act and fund efforts to help distant strangers if someone tells them about the need. So here's how military spending has gone the past few times through. Biden proposes a massive increase above and beyond both what he proposed the year before and what the Congress increased that to. The corporate media reports on the budget proposal mostly as if the single item that takes up more than half of it doesn't even exist. Nobody is asked for a preferable budget proposal, just as no presidential or congressional candidates ever are. The basic facts discoverable from a simple pie chart are kept secret from most people. Zero Democrats object or encourage no votes or vote withholding threats or even state that they will personally vote no. But the Congressional Progressive Caucus publishes a so-called explainer with 3 sentences at the end vaguely objecting. Congress, with Republicans in the lead, proposes a massive increase over and above Biden's massive increase. So-called progressive Democrats whimper about the Republican increase, suggesting through omission that it was the only increase. But zero Democrats object or encourage no votes or vote withholding threats or even state that they will personally vote no. The one exception I know of was in the Senate one year, and not exactly a Democrat, Bernie Sanders once said that he would vote no. Then the bill passes both houses and is signed into law. And progressive Democrats tell people they voted no. And moreover, they've co-sponsored the People Over the Pentagon Act. But that latter is a bill to reduce a bit the military spending that has gone through the roof during the years they've been proposing that bill. A bill that won't pass the House, but if it did, would have to pass the Senate and the president. And then military spending could simply be increased by the $100 billion that bill reduces it by. If a Congress member or a caucus thereof were serious, they would do what the Progressive Caucus did to oppose the Manchin dirty oil deal. They withheld their votes from a Democrats-only procedural vote to bring a bill to the floor unless that deal was left out, and they got what they wanted. But that bill was last year's Military Authorization Act. Never once have they organized and withheld their votes to reduce military spending. This, I think, should be our primary demand to them. Will you speak out about the need for your colleagues to join you in voting no on military spending unless it is significantly reduced? Doing so on every relevant vote, whether or not you expect to succeed, but even if you might succeed. A caucus of Congress members in a single House can change policy by withholding votes, depending how many of them there are, how many are in on the vote, and what other members are voting with them for their own reasons. And I don't think many Congress members believe that many of their constituents know that. Might they risk making it worse than the current course of quickly destroying all life on Earth? Perhaps, but they'd make an actual effort and we'd see who did and who didn't and needed pressure. A single Congress member can force a swift debate and vote on ending a war such as Yemen or Syria. I know that most Congress members are confident their constituents have never heard of that. Not one Democrat spoke in support of a recent resolution to end U.S. war making in Syria. How many of them have heard from us that we want that war ended, troops brought home from everywhere, foreign bases closed, and military spending slashed? The media's biggest lie on military spending is that of omission. Our job is to make it a story. The media's biggest lie overall is that of powerlessness. The reason the government spies on and disrupts and constrains activism is not that its pretense of paying no attention to activism is real, just the opposite. Governments pay very close attention. They know damn well that they cannot continue if we withhold our consent. The constant media push to sit still or cry or shop or wait for an election is there for a reason. The reason is that people have far more power than the individually powerful would like them to know. But we only have it if we exercise it.
Profound words from David Swanson, Executive Director of World Beyond War. And we're going to follow up on a lot of what you said when we get to the Q&A. Thank you, David. It's my great pleasure right now to introduce our next guest. Lindsay Koshgarian her work and commentary on the federal budget and military spending has appeared on NPR, the BBC, CNN, The Nation, and so forth. She is the program director at the National Priorities Project. Her work is at the intersection of military and domestic federal spending. Lindsay got her start as a clinic worker and organizer at Planned Parenthood in central and suburban Philadelphia, and led economic development and affordable housing studies at the University of Massachusetts Donahue Institute prior to joining the National Priorities Project in 2014. Lindsay holds a degree from UCLA and a BA in physics from the University of Pennsylvania. That's a Master of Public Policy from UCLA. Welcome, Lindsay Koshgarian, to CODEPINK Congress.
Thanks for having me, everyone. And thanks, David, for your remarks. A lot of really good insights there. And I'm looking forward to the discussion part of this so we can delve more into some of that. I am here, and I have a couple of the same points as David, but I'm here to really talk about the numbers. Because as we know, the Biden budget request was released on March 9th. And unfortunately, it's a status quo request when it comes to Pentagon and war. So that's what we're dealing with. And I'm going to give you some of the numbers and a little bit of context for those numbers. And I'm going to take a second to try to share some slides with you if I can. So bear with me for a second here.
Do you need us to make a co-host or you're good? Okay.
I think, yeah, let's see if this works. All right. Tell me what are you seeing slides? Yes. Okay. I see some heads nodding. All right, let's go. So we are on our way to a $1 trillion budget. And I know some of you will have heard already that we're at $1 trillion on something like national security or whatever you want to call it. That's absolutely true if you include things like veterans care and homeland security and things, and we look at it that way too. But I'm talking about just strictly the military budget. And we are on our way to $1 trillion there. And so that's a mark that we have not hit previously since World War II, and we're getting very close. So here is a graph that shows you this, but only going back to the 1970s. But you can see the Reagan area back there, which many of us remember to varying degrees, maybe. But remember how sky high that was? We're way, way beyond that now. And we first kind of reached this level at the peak of the 9/11 wars when we were surging in Iraq and Afghanistan, and spending went up, and then it came down again with thanks, I have to say, to the Tea Party and their budget control measures and sequestration, which was very bad for social services, but which did result in some decreases to military spending. But we're right back up there again. And we're right back up there in a world where we no longer have any active wars officially that the US is involved in. Now, of course, we all know what the exceptions to that are, but it's notable still that we are officially in peacetime, and this is one of the highest military budgets on record and is as high as it has been since World War II. Now you might see this little dip down here where it looks like the Biden request is lower than the most recent point, but that's only because the Biden request doesn't have the Ukraine aid in it yet. And once Congress gets around to that, and once Congress gets around to whatever other increases they do, most likely that last data point is going to shoot right up. And just again, to remind, David made this point, we officially pulled out of the war in Afghanistan. It is the first time on record that the United States has ended a war and saw no decrease in military spending. There was no peace dividend. There was no attempt to even find a peace dividend. Instead, military spending just kept right on climbing. Now, here's where we are right now. This is the current year discretionary budget. This is the pot of money that Congress approves every year. And so this is what every year when they go through budget fights and we have government shutdowns and all of that, this pot of money is what all of that drama is about. And right now we're just about where we've been, give or take a little bit for years and years, which is that 51% of this budget is going to the military. Now you'll notice the next biggest chunk, and this is a newer trend, is the next biggest chunk is for veterans. And that chunk of money has been increasing because we keep churning out so many veterans, because we keep having so many wars. So this part of the pie is just getting bigger and bigger as that happens. And altogether, it accounts for well more than half. And what, of course, that means is that any other legitimate things that you might want your government to do, invest in education, invest in infrastructure, invest in renewable energy, invest in regulation of industry, all of those things have to squeeze into a smaller and smaller part of the pie. Now, this is, so that was the current budget where we are now. This is the Biden budget in blue compared to orange where we are now. So as you can see, there are little bumps here and there, sometimes the blue Biden number is a little higher than the orange current number, but it's almost exactly the same. That's the first thing you'll see. The second thing, of course, or maybe the first thing you see, is just how huge the military portion of this budget is compared to everything else. It's by far the biggest thing, and the Biden budget doesn't change that at all. So this is what we're dealing with right now with this budget proposal. And now here's another thing. I mentioned some of us are used to hearing $1 trillion already for something like national security. This is a number that these are numbers that came directly from the Biden budget itself, and they break it down into categories that they call security and non-security. And I'm putting those in quotes because let me tell you what their definition of security and non-security is. So security, you'll see here, takes fully two-thirds of the Biden budget proposal. And security to them means the military, that's the Department of Defense and the nukes at the Department of Energy. It includes the Department of Homeland Security. It includes Veterans Affairs. And I've actually added medical back into that. So now this part does have veterans medical in it. Nuclear weapons, intelligence, foreign relations. So they include the State Department over here. But that's not a very big chunk anyway. So that's fully two-thirds, and that's what they call security. Now, what they call non-security is only 1 in 3 federal dollars. And what they call non-security is housing, food, public education, public health, community investments. Those are non-security, which is in our daily lives what most of us think of as security. All of those things officially to our federal government are not security. So this is what we're looking at in the bigger budget picture when you aren't just looking strictly at the military. And in case any of us have forgotten, we're coming from, just less than a couple of years ago, the failure to pass the entirety of the Build Back Better package that was what Biden had promised, and that included a lot of things like childcare and additional healthcare investments and other things that totally failed to pass the Senate. And Joe Manchin was the one who got the fault, but this has been a failure ongoing for a long time. And we keep hearing again and again that we can't afford all of these other programs that we need, but we know where the money is going. So we know that that's an empty claim. So here's just a little bit of information about what's actually in this Biden military budget request. The total request is $886 billion for the military, and this includes only a very small amount of Ukraine aid. So we would compare this to numbers from the past that also didn't include Ukraine aid, because what will happen is that they expect that Congress will just go ahead and pass that aid down the road. So it includes $842 billion for the Department of Defense itself. It includes almost $33 billion for nukes at the Department of Energy. It includes $11.5 billion in other spending, which is things like some what they call defense-related activities at the FBI and some military retirement accounts and other things like that. That last number stays about steady year to year. So that's not where we're looking at the big increase. This budget includes their largest procurement budget ever at $170 billion. So that's the weapons budget. It includes the largest Space Force budget ever at $33 billion, which is almost double what it's been in the past. And remember, the Space Force is really new. It's just a Trump creation, so we haven't had it for very long. But this is what we foretold would happen, is that this budget would balloon, and that's exactly what's happening. It includes $37 billion inside the Pentagon budget for nuclear modernization. So they're talking about things like the Columbia-class submarine and other delivery systems for nuclear weapons. So that's an additional nuclear-related cost. And it also includes a record in recent years on missiles and munitions. And this is because they're planning, this is related to the Ukraine planning. So they're calling for $30.6 billion for missiles and munitions, up from $24.7 billion in this current fiscal year. That's a big increase. That's about a 20% increase. So they're looking for more money all over the place. These are some of the most notable places where these increases are coming from. And this is what they're asking for. I see a comment clarifying nuke on Pentagon and in addition. Yes. So the $32 billion for nukes in this first bullet, that's in the Department of Energy. Those are the actual nuclear weapons. Those are the warheads. Then the $37 billion in the Pentagon is for the delivery systems. That's for the submarines. It's for the bombers. It's for the things that actually take the nuclear weapon and use it to bomb people. So you can add those together to kind of figure out what we're spending. But then that $37 billion is only for modernization. So that's not necessarily everything. That's just what they're calling, they're ramping back up the nuclear commitment. And that's what they're calling that is the modernization. So I hope that answers that question. On Ukraine, of course, this is a big question. That $886 billion total that we're looking at, that's $28 billion higher than the fiscal year we're in right now. So it's a $28 billion increase, but that doesn't include Ukraine aid, because we don't know where Ukraine aid is going to go this year yet. There's a little bit of it in the Biden budget, but only about $6 billion total. And so what we would expect is that Congress is just going to keep adding to that as the year goes on. And last year, the military aid not military aid to Ukraine, the Pentagon portion of military aid was $37 billion. And then there was more in the State Department. So that's not the total, but the Pentagon portion of it was $37 billion. What Biden is requesting in this part is also a $4.8 billion fund for European deterrence, which is something that they've been doing back since 2014 and the Crimea invasion. But that doesn't tell the whole story. That's not, we can't look at that number and say that's what they're spending on Ukraine, because we know there will be more. And because last year there was tens of billions more. So this is just the very beginning of what they're going to be looking for on Ukraine. And then finally, China. And I was gonna read once I close the slideshow, I'll maybe read you a couple of bullet points from the Department of Defense's budget briefing on this, because what you have to know is that they're justifying everything they do on the backs of China and Russia. So just because there's $9 billion in this budget for Pacific deterrence, which really you should read as China deterrence, the truth is that almost all of it, or, easily tens and tens of billions more, are being justified on the back of China. So there's no one number that you can pinpoint, but everything that they are doing, they're talking about either China or Russia at this point. That's their entire story for everything. So, and then finally, what we have to remember about all of this is the Biden request. It's just a request. It has no power in Congress. Congress will do whatever they want. And what Congress typically wants is to fund the Pentagon and military and war at an even higher level. So these are a couple of just headlines from last year's budget. And the House went up by 37 billion, and then the Senate went up by 45 billion, and the higher one won. So we can expect another story similar to this year for how Congress will go through this. Now, I do like to, I'm a fan of the People Over Pentagon Act. We would cut $100 billion. It's not enough. It's especially not enough because it's gone up by $100 billion in just a few years. So taking off $100 billion would only take us back to about 2018. So it's not nearly enough, but it is a significant start. And it is something that has little enough support in Congress that building support for this as a first step is sort of a tactical decision. There is also something, there is the Poor People's Campaign has a Third Reconstruction Act that calls for an initial 10% cut followed by a plan to cut by half. So there are things out there that cut more than this. And there's a Third Reconstruction Act that Representative Barbara Lee, who's the sponsor of this, is also the sponsor of. So there are alternatives out there, but this is one of them. And at National Priorities Project, of course, we focus on what we could buy instead. And here are some of the things we could buy instead. And then finally, because we focus on things we could buy instead, I just want to point out that at our website, we have a calculator where you can choose your state or you can choose your congressional district. You can see what we could buy instead for your state or congressional district. You can use those talking points in your letters to the editor or when you meet with your member of Congress. And those are particularly useful things. Although I will say I fully agree with David's point that we also need to go really hard on why this is bad spending to begin with, and not just talk about what we should be spending on instead. So that's what I've got, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Lindsay Koshgarian, the Program Director for the National Priorities Project. We appreciate you breaking it all down for us, and we'll ask questions in a moment. Medea is going to introduce our next guest.
So our next guest is Danaka Katovich, who is our National Co-Director at CODEPINK and the lead organizer of the Abolish the F-35 campaign. She's a graduate from DePaul University in political science, and she has been working towards ending U.S. participation in the war in Yemen for many years now. At CODEPINK, she also works on the youth outreach as a facilitator of the Peace Collective, which has sometimes hosted these CODEPINK congresses. It's a youth cohort of CODEPINK that focus on anti-imperialist education and divestment. So thank you, Danaka.
Thanks, Medea, and a big thank you to David and Lindsay for their presentations. I'm sort of taking the Pentagon budget and putting it at a smaller scale really quick and talking about the F-35 program. So for just a brief background, the F-35 is the most expensive weapon system. It's going to cost the U.S. taxpayer $1.7 trillion over its lifetime, but probably more than that. It's been riddled with issues and setbacks since the beginning. And my favorite story to tell people, because it is sort of the only funny and harmless story that deals with the F-35, is Lockheed Martin, who manufactures the plane, was supposed to send a prototype to the Paris Air Show, I believe in 2007, and they couldn't get their stuff together in time. And so they instead commissioned paintings of it. and put the paintings at the air show, which always sort of makes me laugh because how ridiculous. So the origin of Code Pink's campaign was in October of 2022. We sent a letter to President Biden and to all members of Congress with over 200 organizational signatures from the US and around the world to cancel the F-35 program. We worked with international groups and countries that were buying the F-35, like Canada, Switzerland, and Germany, and also to organize around the international angle to stop purchases of planes, but we also partnered with organizations in Burlington, Vermont and Greater Vermont, where F-35 training takes place, and in Madison, Wisconsin, where F-35 training is going to take place very shortly. We see the F-35 program as sort of a microcosm of the military-industrial complex. You just heard David and Lindsay talk about how much we spend on the Pentagon budget and how harmful it is. And the F-35 program is just sort of a zoomed in version of that. It's wasteful, it's delayed, it's very, very extremely harmful, it's bad for the environment, etc. So it's been sort of a huge learning tool because sometimes the entire Pentagon budget is sort of hard for people to grasp because it's so large. And where do you cut funding from it? There's so many different programs. So it's hard to get specific. The F-35 program got a lot of criticism from members of Congress last year. So we're using that as leverage. And while war inflation continues to punish working class people in the US, we can point to wasteful programs like this and sort of create the conditions for its cancellation. The previous the previous fighter jet that got canceled in, I believe, 2009 was the F-22, canceled during a recession, very, very similar conditions surrounding the end to that program. But of course, it wasn't replaced by the F-35 because they do different things, sort of. But essentially, the budget gap was filled with the F-35 in the absence of the F-22. So in our letter, we highlight a few different aspects of the letter that I just want to talk to you all about because it gave us a lot of avenues for different groups, not just anti-war groups, to join the letter. And it was, of course, harm through militarism, like David said. We primarily oppose the F-35 as a weapon of war. Israel's attacks on Gaza regularly use the F-35 to kill Palestinians living there. And of course, the inefficiencies and failures that sort of plague the F-35. It's about 9 years behind schedule. And until about a month ago, engine deliveries were delayed because of a crash in Fort Worth, Texas, back in December. The Government Accountability Office said that the F-35 continues to fall short of prescribed mission capable rates and is consistently missing reliable targets. In 2021, only 50% of the planes were mission capable. And then the F-35B was fully mission capable less than 20% of the time. And the F-35C was only capable 9.5% of the time. Obviously, the cost to taxpayer, I said it cost $1.7 trillion over his lifetime. In spending billions to trillions of dollars on a plane that's not yet up to speed with what the government has requested is poor fiscal policy. So for groups and people that care about that, that's how they sort of bought into the F-35 campaign. Environmental impact also. The F-35 uses a significant amount of fuel, about 2.37 gallons of fuel per every mile traveled, and about 1,300 gallons of fuel per hour. The F-35, I also want to highlight in the context of, people are very, very worried of a nuclear confrontation between Russia and the US. The F-35 also is part of the US Strategic Nuclear Bombing Force, processing the capability to carry and deploy the B-6112 guided nuclear bomb. And you all probably assume this, nuclear bombs are not good for the environment or for people. So they're relatively new from what I understand, the bombs. They can detonate beneath the Earth's surface, increasing their destructiveness against underground targets. And it is the equivalent of a surface burst weapon with a yield of 1.2 kilotons, which is basically 83 Hiroshima bombs. Boeing makes this bomb with Sandia Labs, which is also owned by Lockheed Martin. So we have a week of action coming up starting actually on Thursday. We have events in Burlington, Madison, Massachusetts, Philly, New York City, and a few more. There are a few direct actions, so I can't really talk specifics, but please go on CODEPINK's Twitter or Instagram or website, and we will be posting about them there as they come up. We have events on our event page for Burlington and Madison and Philly in New York City starting tomorrow. So please, if you are in those areas, attend. We're encouraging people to go to the Burlington City Council meeting on Monday, the 27th, to give public statements. So if you go to CODEPINK's event page, you can sign up to speak there. And also at the Transportation Committee City Council meeting in Burlington as well. And I encourage everyone to sign the letter as an individual to cancel the F-35 program, and you can go to codepink.org/ground the F-35. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danica. A lot of information there, so chilling. Perhaps you can also post in the chat the link to the letter that you want people to sign. At this point, before we go to our Q&A, we're going to engage you in an action, and Brian's going to go over some of the petitions that we have, and you can choose one. So Brian, take it away.
Thanks, Marcy, and thanks, Danica. I mean, pick a reason to hate the F-35. You have plenty to choose from. So the link is in the chat. You can send a message to your members of Congress saying you don't want your tax dollars going to the F-35 for the many reasons that you just heard. We desperately need that money for so many other things, not another weapon of war that is going to be used to devastate the environment and for just general death and destruction. The other petition that you see now right there in the chat will send a message to the media. We know that the media has been avoiding and ignoring the problem of climate change, but even further, they have completely ignored the connection between climate change and militarism. As I'm sure many of you know, the military, the US military, is the largest single emitter of fossil fuels in the entire world. But this issue gets no attention in the mainstream media. So this is a campaign, a petition that has been put together by CODEPINK. You can send a message to Politico, but not just Politico. I believe it sends messages to other media sites as well, demanding that they pay attention to this, which is one of the most critical issues out there that we're not hearing a peep from in the mainstream media. So we need to make some noise.
Thank you. And while we're conducting this Zoom, the rain has just been torrential. I'm in Santa Barbara and Chumash Land in California, and I was talking to my grandson today. What is an atmospheric river? Yeah, that's what we're facing here in California. So please consider signing that petition as well as the defund the F-35. We're going to now go to our Q&A, and Medea and I will ask some questions and take questions from the chat for our guests. David Swanson, Executive Director of World Beyond War, Lindsay Koshgarian, the Program Director of National Priorities Project, and Danaka Katovich, National Co-Director of CODEPINK. So, Medea, would you like to start, or you want me to go ahead?
Sure. I have a question for you, Lindsay. When the Republicans were voting on Kevin McCarthy as Speaker, and there was that uprising among some of the folks who part of what they were calling for was that $75 billion cut in the Pentagon budget as part of cuts all around that would be in line with the debt ceiling. Where does that stand now? I'm sure there's a lot of opposition to that within Republicans, but do you expect, and could you tell us the numbers that generally vote against the Pentagon budget, Democrats and Republicans, and for what reasons?
Yeah, so all really good questions. So first of all, of course, you're talking about when Kevin McCarthy was very dramatically finally made speaker. We know that behind closed doors, he agreed to something about limiting spending and including Pentagon spending. And a lot of the media coverage really focused on the Pentagon part with like a knee jerk, we can't possibly cut Pentagon spending type of reaction. So that was not terribly helpful. What I know since then, the rumor is that there's going to be a Republican budget proposal from the House Republicans. They're going to propose what I am hearing, and this is not in any way official, is that they're going to propose spending at fiscal year 2022 levels across the board. So what that means, and then they're promising that there's going to be a vote on that in the House. And so what that means is that the vote will be not just on cutting the Pentagon to 2022 levels, but on cutting everything, on cutting the CDC, on cutting public education, on cutting, the EPA, anything, any part of government you can think of, except for Social Security and Medicare, which are separate. So that's it's not a straightforwardly easy vote for progressives. So that's a problem with it. Another problem is, as you say, that the vast majority of Republicans don't want to cut Pentagon spending, but they sure do want to cut social service spending. So I don't know what that fight is going to play out, how that fight within the Republican Party is going to play out. But it's really not clear what the vote will be. What we can assume that all the Democrats are going to vote against this thing because of the social cuts. And so that part is pretty straightforward. But I'll also just say that, taking it back to FY22 levels is less of a cut than the 100 billion People Over Pentagon Act. So legislatively, the People Over Pentagon Act is a much better bet because it cuts more from the Pentagon and it doesn't cut all of those other things. So that's kind of how I see it.
Thank you, Lindsay.
That before we get too excited about those Republicans who want to make cuts in the Pentagon, what I've seen is that what they want to cut is any kind of green energy type things in the Pentagon, and also any diversity programs, what they call wokeism, right, Lindsay?
Yeah, which is not going to get them anywhere near the kind of cut that they're promising. So, because guess what? The Pentagon doesn't spend all that much on green energy or any kind of diversity. So that's a complete non-starter. I don't know exactly how that's going to play out. And I think, there is the danger of sort of the toxicity of some of the people on the right who are calling for this and at the same time are, affiliating with white supremacists and things like that. So that's a tough one too.
Point well taken. I have a question for David, and that is about the dirty deal that was part of, I believe, the NDAA that you referenced earlier, saying progressives laid down the gauntlet, said they weren't going to vote for this bill if that was included, and then it was stripped from the bill. So when I pose a similar question to members of Congress, progressives or people who call themselves progressive, and say, why don't you withhold your vote on some of these key issues? They will say to me, well, the Republicans have enough votes to pass it with the hawkish Democrats. We withhold our votes on whatever it is, it's not going to make a difference.
Can you point to something in their lifetimes that has made a difference? I think the point is to try. And my God, for goodness sakes, sign on to every good bill, whether it cuts a dime or 50% of the Pentagon, and go out there and yell and scream and organize and whip your colleagues to do so. My concern is not what's in the bill. It's that it's not going to pass the House. And if it did, it would have to pass the Senate, and it would have to pass the president, and it would have to deal with the fact that they could just increase the military spending to counter the decrease in military spending. The point of withholding votes is that you can do it in one house. And you don't need the other house, and you don't need the White House. And what you do gets done, and it's not undone by some other legislation that you're going along with. And so there are opportunities, such as the picking of a speaker, such as a partisan procedural vote where you're not dealing with Republicans, such as a vote on military authorization where the Republicans are all voting no for their own cockamamie reasons about wokeism or whatever it might be. Who cares? The point is to try to line up every Democrat and Republican, if you can get them, who's willing for the right reasons or loony reasons to demand reduced military spending and withhold votes, and see if you can get it. And then we see who's trying and we see who's not trying, because, sign on to every good bill, hooray. But I don't expect me to believe you're really trying. The handful who do vote no, this was, I think, a good question from Medea. Who typically does vote no in each party, and what reasons or excuses do they provide? The small number who do, my concern is if they meant it, why don't they say they're going to do it beforehand? Why don't they publicly whip their colleagues to do it with them? Why don't they try to do it on every possible procedural vote where it might have a better chance of working? Why do they just wait until they're sure the damn thing's going to pass and then vote no, and then go brag to their constituents about it as if they think we're idiots?
Good point, David. Yeah, and if you stay on the Zoom, all of you, we're going to be calling in a few minutes our Congress members and ask them to do what David just said, announce ahead of time that they're going to vote no. Medea.
Well, Danica, I know that you've been trying to organize young people around both the F-35 campaign and the anti-militarism in general, as well as the Ukraine war. Can you tell us some of the ways that you try to reach young people on these issues to get them to care?
Yeah, for sure. It took a while, but I think we tried to sort of a pilot program here in Chicago. I'm in Chicago, I didn't mention that earlier, where we wanted to go after something specific, where young people felt like the war is, and militarism is a big issue. How do you make young people who have their country's been at war their entire lives? How do you make them feel like they have power in this situation? It's a hard question to answer. And here in Chicago, we're like, Mike Quigley, who's my congressperson, but also represents a couple universities here in the city, so a lot of young people, is one of the biggest war hawks around Ukraine. He's kind of a lesser known fella, but he is terrible on this issue. And we found out he was taking a bunch of money from weapons companies. So we were like, if we have a very specific ask here in Chicago and we bring in young people who are already in the Peace Collective, which is CODEPINK's youth cohort that's around the country, but we have some people here, and then also the student groups at the universities, and we bring them in to work on it. We have a specific ask. We have our CODEPINK pledge to ask him to sign to stop taking money from weapons companies. And then through that political education, we ended up talking about Ukraine. We ended up talking about Yemen, all of the wars that these companies are profiting off of, and therefore Mike Quigley is making money off of. So that's how we sort of did it here. And now I'm excited to try it out around other places. So if that seems interesting to you, there's a lot of members of Congress who do take money from these companies. But yeah, I would say finding where young people have the levers and where you can convince them that they have the levers and they can kind of see it and put it into action with, concrete tasks. Like we did protests outside of his office every day for, I think, a month and a half. So sort of things like that, where they can kind of pick at it every day and have something tangible to do.
Thank you, Danica. I'm so glad you mentioned the pledge that CODEPINK uses and you've used with success in organizing. We have it on, I believe, on the CODEPINK website. You can create your own for your own organization, where you ask your Congress member to pledge not to take money from the 5 top military contractors. All right, let's unmute and thank our guests before we move on to our Capitol calling party. So everybody, let's say
thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
Lindsay, Danica.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes. All right, now we're going to move to our Capitol calling party portion. And Maha, if you could be so kind as to post the script. We know the number. I'll
Oh, you muted yourself, Marcy.
Here we go. 224-3121. It's the same drill that we've done before. My name is Marcy Winograd, and I'm your constituent in zip code 93105. Please announce that you are voting no on President Biden's $842 billion military budget for 2024. This outrageous budget includes $9 billion for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative to prepare for war with China and almost $70 billion for nuclear weapons. Say no to Biden's military budget and announce your opposition ahead of the vote. How does that sound?
That was 40 million.
No, it's 37. I think she said it's 32 and 37. One of them, I think the 37 is for nuclear. I don't call it modernization. I call it nuclear rearmament because they're producing new nuclear warheads. And the other is for maintaining other nuclear weapons that we have. So it's almost 70 billion when you look at it, in totality. Okay.
But we're following the script that says 40, correct?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I learned something tonight, so we can say 70. All right, let's go. I want to see everybody on the phone. I'm going to get on my phone. I'm going to call my congressperson right now.
The number again, please, Marcy.
The number again?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, Marcy.
Yes, I left a message. How about you, Medea? Were you able to leave a message?
You left a really long message.
Well, I was on a roll, I guess. Anyway, we've been on for about an hour, and we know that John Douglas, are you still with us? We love your music, and thank you, Duncan Nichols in Delaware, for providing us with that song about the F-35 that we played initially. So I don't know if John's still with us.
Just made a co-host.
Okay, John, he's ready to go. John Douglas, we love your music. Thank you so much. Let's go.
Well, thank you. I love what you do too, my neighbor. Here's a song that we're all familiar with. We've all sung it on hundreds of marches over the years.
Let's unmute and thank John Douglas for that fabulous.
Beautiful.
Oh, that was awesome, John.
Nicely done, nicely done.
Glad to be back.
Such a talent.
Very uplifting.
Yes. All right, with that, we're going to close our Code Pink Congress tonight. Please join us again always the first and third Tuesday of the month, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, and keep calling every day. Call them, please. Yes, we've got to apply as much pressure as we can. Call, show up, organize. So thank you.
Night, everybody. Thank you.
Night.